Good afternoon, and thank you for joining our webinar today. My name is Eric Kinder from Learning Sciences International, and I'm your host for today's webinar. Today, we're taking a close look at Des Moines Public Schools and how they expanded equity and are closing achievement gaps, becoming a true model for urban education. Des Moines Public Schools launched a Schools for Rigor initiative in the 2016-2017 school year in an effort to build capacity to prepare educators and students for a future where critical thinking, social, and emotional skills are essential. The results of their effort have resulted in an increase in rigor, expanded equity, and achievement gaps that are closing. Before we start, I have a few helpful reminders for today's webinar. Our webinar is scheduled for about 45 minutes or so, and we'll have time for questions throughout the webinar. Due to the size of the audience, your audio lines are muted during the presentation. However, we welcome your questions and comments, and you can submit those using the GoToWebinar question pane located on your screen. Finally, today's webinar will be recorded with a link distributed to you via email. Feel free to share the presentation with colleagues who are unable to attend. We will also include a complimentary copy of the case study on the Des Moines Public Schools initiative. Our conversation today will begin with Dr. Libba Lyons, who oversees all the Schools for Rigor partnerships across the U.S. Dr. Lyons will provide an overview of the partnership between LSI and Des Moines Public Schools. Next, Dr. Lindsay Devers-Basalio will dive into the data and the results. She's a certified What Works Clearinghouse reviewer and conducted the research and analysis on this initiative. We will then dive into what this initiative looks like at the ground level with Sarah Kroll and Janice Andrews. Sarah is the author of the very popular book, Student Teaming, You Got This, Teacher Survival Guide. Sarah has been instrumental in building and delivering the professional development used in this Schools for Rigor partnerships. Dr. Janice Andrews leads the implementation of the Schools for Rigor initiative in Des Moines. Joining the LSI speakers will be a talented team from Des Moines Public Schools, including Mike Lord, Director of Elementary Schools, Cheryl Modlin and Jill Burke, who are both principals, and Erica Eganhouse, who is an academic coach. Without further delay, let's start the presentation with Dr. Libba Lyons.
Thank you, Eric. And welcome to all of our participants today. First of all, I'd like to give you a quick introduction to LSI, especially for those of you who haven't worked with us yet. Learning Sciences International, or LSI, was founded in April of 2002 by former university faculty and researchers. We're a research-based organization dedicated to supporting the development of expertise in teaching and instructional leadership. LSI has served as a statewide contractor for Readings First, Classrooms for the Future, the Pennsylvania Act 48 Continuing Professional Development and Education, and most recently in Florida's Race to the Top. Our work has included a partnership with major educational philanthropies, including the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and also with the Wallace Foundation in some projects that I'm going to discuss more fully with you in a moment. We work nationwide with large urban, suburban, and small rural districts and schools. And we have Schools for Rigor partnerships throughout the state of Florida, in Cleveland, Ohio, in Des Moines, Iowa, as we're going to discuss here, Evansville, Indiana, Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, Dayton, Ohio, Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and Grand Island, Nebraska. Our vision for education is to close the achievement gap by equipping all students with the social, emotional, and cognitive skills they need to thrive in the new economy of the 21st century. We are driven by our belief that expanding equity in the classroom will free children from generational poverty. So let's talk about the partnership. We began our partnership with Des Moines Public Schools in 2014 with a partnership on the Wallace Principal Supervisor Initiative Grant. And at that time, we were assisting the district in implementing a hierarchical evaluation model that spanned from the principal supervisors to principals to teachers with aligned expectations for performance. And then in 2015, LSI was vetted by the Wallace Foundation as a national provider of leader tracking system technology support. And Des Moines Public Schools expanded their partnership with us in developing their leader tracking system and leadership pipeline work. Des Moines Public Schools' goal is to become the nation's model for urban education. And in 2016, Des Moines Public Schools began working with us in 22 schools to prepare their students and educators for a future in which new jobs, skills, functions, and disciplines are essential to success. In 2016-17 school year, 6 schools in Des Moines began the process of becoming schools for rigor. And then in 2017-18, 16 additional schools began this journey to increase rigor in all classrooms. Reading through this graph that I'm showing here, you can see that Des Moines Public Schools has a very diverse student population with a larger than average proportion of English learners and a high percentage of students of poverty. During the 2017-18 school year, the study focused on approximately 890 teachers in 22 schools who received LSI's Ignite Core Instruction Professional Development Series. These teachers taught 10,431 students, who are the focus of this report. So just a brief description of Schools for Rigor. The model that, in Des Moines Public Schools involves systemic change, creating a strong culture of mutual accountability among school leaders, teachers, and students. Leaders move their schools rapidly to higher levels of performance through 30-day action plans and daily classroom observations with feedback. Instruction shifts from teacher-centered to student-centered, and students work and learn to work in academic teams and take ownership of their own learning and for the learning of their team members. In year 2 schools, we had senior level LSI leadership coach in these schools, while in the first year we had an LSI certified district coach. We're building capacity in that district in this way. The leadership teams received guidance on how to break down standards into smaller targets and ensured planning time for teachers. And teachers received direction on how to cultivate student teams where students challenge each other to reach high levels of rigorous learning. Students were guided to their own learning, to own their own learning, and to take responsibility for their progress. So with this overview done, I'm going to turn this presentation over to my good friend and colleague, Dr. Lindsay Devers-Basilio.
Thank you, Libba. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Lindsay, and I'm excited to present the findings from the studies. A couple things that I want to just make sure that I go through. This slide right here is like a 30-page paper, so I have just a couple of highlights for you guys so you can understand some of the rates you're going to see and that I'm going to go over with you. The first thing is that students were matched to like students in non-treatment schools. And that is important. It creates a quasi-experimental design so that you have students going through the treatment. Sorry, I heard an echo. There we go. You have students who are going through the treatment and students who are not going through the treatment in the same time frame. So it's always important that you, when you're trying to figure out whether or not you have significant achievement, whatever outcome you're measuring, you always want to have a comparison group. So we created a comparison group from the other schools in Des Moines who were not in the treatment. The next thing is What Works Clearinghouse certification, or What Works Clearinghouse process. The big highlight here is that you have to demonstrate, if you don't have true random assignment, you have to be able to demonstrate baseline equivalence between the groups, which in simple terms mean that the groups are equal. If you go through the appendix and methodology section, I go through all the Hedges G's and the equations to do that, and all of the groups presented were proven to be equal. The other big thing is that you need to model the schools using hierarchical linear modeling, or HLM, to account for clustering of students within schools, and that was done. And then the last kind of big piece that you want to look for in evaluation is that you always include the pretest, which in this case we use the NWEA or MAP assessment. So the pretest would be the fall MAP score, and then the outcome would be the spring MAP score. So you always want to make sure that that pretest, which would be the fall MAP score in this case, is included in the models. So you're adjusting for any differences between the groups. So if one group just scored higher by chance, you're going to make sure that that is accounted for in the models. All findings that you see here are statistically significant. The other big piece I wanted to talk about is effect sizes. Bloom and colleagues, 2008, it's cited in the paper. If you are really into this, I ask you to read that article. It's really eye-opening in terms of their view of how you should use effect sizes, and that's kind of how the paper is laid out. We calculate learning rates in the paper, and what was so monumental in this paper is that if you actually look at the effect sizes by grade level of how much students learn, you can see in kindergarten, first grade, students learn almost one full standard deviation compared when you drop down to 10th grade, and it's typically about a 10th standard deviation. So the big aha is when you actually look at the average gain in general from fall to spring on any assessment. It's not just a map. You could do this with any assessment, any national assessment. The patterns are the same. Students in kindergarten and first grade actually learn at a higher rate than high school students. It's a very interesting phenomenon. So the whole point of the article was that unless you take that into account, you never know how much you're actually, in terms of subgroups, you never know how much you're actually closing the gap, right? Because it gives you the denominator. So how much do students in Des Moines typically learn in a year? So it gives you that denominator to give you a benchmark to see how well your treatment students performed. And when I say treatment students, I'm referring to our Schools for Rigor students. So really, I'm just going over my notes here, making sure I get all the points. The last thing I wanted to talk about, I talked about this a little bit, but the subgroup gap closure. So we're able to create effect sizes that determines exactly how much of a gap there is. For example, so you'll have Black students, white students, you'll take the mean difference between them, and it's divided by the pooled standard deviation. Hopefully when I said pooled standard deviation, I'm not losing anybody on the call, but I will pick it up pretty fast. The last piece is, it's very important, the entire study, the changes that we're about to present to you happened within 162 school days. So that is huge in the time frame that you have to work with. I'll talk about those school days a little bit more, but I think that's all I have to say for this slide. So this slide represents all the students in the 22 schools. You can see it ended up being about 8,000 students in reading and about 10,000 in math that had both pre and post tests. And these students were again matched to control students, and they had an overall 7% gain. Schools for Rigor students had a 7% gain in reading over the otherwise expected gain, so over the average gain. The same thing happened for math. So they had Schools for Rigor students had a 3% gain over the other expected gain in the entire district. So the next slide, Our year 2 schools, so these schools were those who were in their second year of implementation. They actually doubled, schools for Rigor students doubled their rate of learning compared to those students in the first slide, which means they learned at a faster rate because they were practicing these strategies more, and their teachers were already kind of familiar with implementing some of the model and teaming. So this was kind of a huge finding that we saw. Year 1 schools had a gain, and it was statistically significant, and it mattered. At year 2 schools actually doubled that rate. I didn't talk about the learning gains, so I do want to, these gains here, the learning rates, are equivalent to extra days in learning. So in reading, there was 21 extra days of learning, and in math, there was 10 extra days of learning. So out of the 162 days of learning for all students in Des Moines, the treatment students got an extra 21 days is the equivalent of the effect. The high school students had the largest gains out of everybody. So this is Schools for Rigor high school students had a 37% gain in reading over the average gain otherwise expected for all high school students in the district within that 162 days. And you can see that is equivalent to 61 extra days of learning in the school year. The same thing for math. Math was Schools for Rigor high school students had 26% gain in math over the average gain otherwise expected for all high school students in the district within that same 162 days. And that was equivalent to 42 extra days of learning. So the closing achievement gap. The big takeaway from this slide, I don't know how I can say this more, but these gaps closed for Black students, 7%. They closed by 6% in math. For students with disability, 6% in reading, closed 5% in math, and EL students, 6% in reading, 4% in math. The huge takeaway from this is that this all happened within 162 school days. In other words, from fall math administration to spring math administration. So you guys are in the district, you know all of the things that can impact instructional time, and these were the findings that we had.
Thanks, Libba and Lindsay. My name is Sarah Kroll, and I'm honored to get to talk about the work that was done in the field with the teachers, the leaders, and the district level leaders at Des Moines Public Schools. I just want to reiterate, Libba talked to you about 82% of students being at free and reduced lunch. So I want you to think about that number. When I was in Des Moines, it was in the winter, it was negative 22 degrees, and school was called off for snow that Monday. And I went Tuesday hoping school would be back open, which it wasn't. And then at the district level, they decided they were going to do a half day. And I thought, wow, that's a lot of work. And when I was talking to some of the district level leaders, I asked them why. And they told me that the kids hadn't eaten, many of the kids hadn't eaten since that Friday. And with there not being school Monday, it was detrimental to keep them out of school again that Tuesday. And I share that because the practitioners I have on the webinar today, Mike, Erica, Jill, and Cheryl, are amongst some of the hardest working educators in Des Moines Public Schools. And that just gives you a really big picture of who we're working with. So we want to show a video that actually shows one teacher's experience with the transformation she saw with her students and with herself in the classroom. So we'll have Eric key up the video.
it says, okay, but it begins and first. Yeah. The same thing, first, maybe then finally last. So yeah. Where? So just in case, why don't we all reread because we all have different opinions. Okay.
The students are working together, they're processing together, and they're really challenging each other. And I find myself stepping back and just watching the learning happen and watching them work hard and challenge each other. And now I know exactly where each student is every day based on that target. And in the end, I think they're learning even deeper because they're challenging it on themselves.
Okay, that video just gave you a very short clip of some students working together and a teacher being surprised at the transformation. In this graph, you'll see sort of, if you follow with me on the first one, the T would be the teacher. So this is teacher-centered instruction. This is how most of us learned. And we are standing in front of the room, we're working as hard as we can, and we're really trying to reach every student. But in this traditional style teaching, it's impossible or really hard to get to every student because we're trying to monitor kids individually. So when we shift over to this teacher-led student group image, the squares here will be the desks and the dots are the students. The teacher is in the center of the learning, teaching to the standards, breaking the standard into learning targets, having clear success criteria for the students to understand what is exactly expected of them. And we're putting strategies in place for kids to kind of get in these groups. And our hope is that they will start working together. And then the final image, you'll see the student-led academic teams. So again, if you look at the arrows, we now have this cross-functional, we have kids helping within their teams, we have them helping other teams, and the teachers really in the middle there to help facilitate, to clear up misconceptions, but really they're taking themselves out and letting the kids do most of the learning and really trying to get to this level of rigor. So the student-centered instruction employs this power where the students feel like they can really challenge each other and they have some accountability. The benefits are immeasurable, but we don't go from the first image to the third. We don't expect that to happen. We have to go through this progression, and through the professional development that the teachers in Des Moines received, they started, with that first image and moved towards how to start implementing some of those strategies in the second image and how to really shift the classroom instruction to become more student-centered with rigor. And Erica Eganhouse is a phenomenal teacher who actually became a coach recently, and I think she has a really good perspective on seeing this shift. So Erica, if you want to share with us.
Yeah, so I'm an instructional coach now, but I was teaching first grade, and I was teaching first grade in our year 1 of treatment, and I completely can relate to this, the dots on the left with the teacher-centered instruction. I was like knower of all the knowledge in the class with, the first graders, and I would be giving them the information and standing up there for like 20 minutes, and then I would go send them off on their little merry ways to their desks, and then it would be like a guessing game by the end to see if all of my hard work had really paid off. And so in that first year, when I began my shift from teacher-centered to teacher-led student groups, I really began to see the impact that it had on my students, not just their scores, but their personalities and the social impact that it made on them to be able to talk and interact with each other. And they were just 6 years old. So I realized then that I'm like, I have to teach them how to talk to each other and teach them how to have that useful interactions, because I knew I love doing research myself, and I knew I was like, okay, getting them in groups, this is a highly effective strategy. And I thought, oh, just putting them in partners or work together in this group before, that'll make a huge difference. But during this treatment, we figured out exactly how to do that and what an effective group looks like and sounds like, and how to set it up and what to look for, what to listen for, how to monitor. So you eventually give up a little bit on your standing in front of the room and having that full control. And that's really challenging for some teachers because they like to be in the front of the room. They like to know what everybody's doing and sitting. And in this middle teacher-led student groups model, like the students are really doing it. And you're just kind of checking in with them. And you're not just checking in with them to say, get back to work or sit down. You're not doing that anymore. It's checking in, what are you learning? It's totally monitoring for learning. And to be able to do that as a first grade teacher, you know, some people call it like herding kittens because they just run all over the place. Well, they stay in groups and they work together and you can monitor for that learning. And that was a really, really awesome transition for me to be able to undergo as a first grade teacher. And it really inspired me as a coach because my coach really helped me to move along and to see how helpful and how successful these strategies are in so many different ways for the students. So it was hard to let go a little and to let my students really show me what they were learning instead of me standing up and telling them what I had known and what I learned.
Thank you, Erica. You know, it's really about what I heard you say is you had to change your behavior and you had to change habits, and that's really difficult. Mike Lord is also on the webinar. He's the director of elementary schools in Des Moines. I've had the privilege of walking with him at some trainings. He works in some really tough schools. He's an awesome leader. Mike, tell me about, you know, the mindset. We talk about changing our habits, but what about the mindset that we continue to work on?
Well, you know, Sarah, I mean, with any second order change takes planning, communication, and conviction of any leader, and as well as, and I would categorize teachers as leaders, and especially principals and coaches, you know, and challenging that mindset. And really what you're doing is challenging historically what teachers have always done, probably like you said, in your beginning, is how teachers, they were taught. And so when we made that core shift from focusing on what teachers are teaching to what students are learning, that's when we started seeing mind shifts, and that's when we started seeing teachers start shifting their thinking and their beliefs. But that's not an easy thing to do. And we didn't feel like we had to label what they were doing, what their current practice was, as bad in order to make a change to be good. We had to honor where they were and then grow them from that practice and help them see. And we started turning corners, and we're still continuing to see that as we're turning corners as teachers see the impact of what students can do when they release, and the power of them stepping back from trying to monitor 24 kids. That's 1 to 24. When we start lowering those ratios to 1 to 4 or 5 groups, and then starting to see students starting to lead those academic teams, and then they're monitoring each other, the shift comes from a lot of where the teacher is doing the heavy lifting to where the students are, and the teacher truly is guiding the work and bringing thoughtful questions back. You know, so continually we keep bringing that back. Is in classrooms. Just today, we had a great conversation with a teacher that she's making this shift and she's starting to think, but then she kind of comes back and she said, man, I'm really struggling with this. How do I get over this next hump? And so she's looking for something specific, some little coaching point that can move her to that next level of her self-reflection, how she can grow in order to be better for her students.
Thanks, Mike. I love that, you know, constantly coaching and collaboration, and just you seeing that difference at your level. That's really powerful. The next image you'll see on the next slide is our implementation cycle. So we have training is delivered in 4 cycles. This graphic shows you that step 1 is the professional development. An LSI consultant will come and deliver a professional development day. And after that day, which is actually pretty cool, step 2 is classroom visits. And this happens, if schedule permits, immediately. So we're going in right after the training, not to see is it perfectly done, but are people trying the strategies, not putting the binder on the shelf and forgetting about the training, but really digging in right away. We have found that has made all the difference. as well as that side-by-side coaching and collaboration. There's a lot of building capacity, coaching in terms of the school leaders down to the coaches, and like you heard from Erica, to the teacher level. And then the adjustment and support from the evidence. What do we need to do to make changes? Jill is on the webinar. She's an elementary school principal at Howe Elementary, phenomenal school. Jill, tell me about the coaching and collaboration piece, because that's really what your strong suit was when we were talking.
Yeah, well, so I would say I'm going to talk a little bit about our transformation from year 1 to year 3, if that's okay, a little bit, because our first year, our focus was mostly on looking at our standards and the alignment, because we were not there yet. So we really had to do a lot of professional development on what did the standards mean, what level of rigor were they at, and were we aligned in the instruction that was taking place in the classroom. And so our first year focused on getting a few teachers to come on board, to buy in, to really start implementing a lot of the new PD or professional development we were getting from LSI. So we'd have a rigor diagnostics. Prior to that was professional development. And then based off our rigor diagnostics, we would jump in and create a plan, a 45-day plan with action steps that would be monitored by the instructional coaches. And through that process, we would go into classrooms, we'd check implementation. We also had our consultant come back within that time frame of the 45 days and also participate in what we call C4I, a coach for instruction, as well as having an SLC, a strategic leadership coaching throughout that process. So that first year, we really strengthened our PLCs, focused on what we're doing in the classroom, and we're trying to make that shift from teacher-centered to more of a student-centered, because we realized we had to make sure we had quality instruction before we could have kids talk together. That second year, we then started focusing more on that teaming, getting kids to talk more, having that accountable talk. Before we could do that, though, we had to focus in on social emotional learning. We have kids that don't know how to communicate with each other, have a really hard time disagreeing. We actually had one student that when someone disagreed with her, she slapped him in the face. And so we had to really build in some skills for our kids to help them have conversations that were deep and allow them to get to that analysis level. And so that was kind of more of a year 2, but still following that same process of every 45 days, having a rigor diagnostics, going into random classrooms, looking at the data, coming back, looking at our SIM model, the school instructional maturity model, and really trying to see how can we get to vision sooner? How can we get from teacher-centered classroom to student-centered classroom, and then finally over into that team-centered classroom? And so finally this year, the conditions are in place, the teachers are all on board, the conversations that they have during their PLCs are so rich and so focused on the standards, the alignment, what level of rigor they're at, what the standard means. And it just really, it took a process, and it took LSI providing different professional developments, different follow-up with implementation checks. We're in classrooms constantly. The coaches and I meet every day. We look at our action board, we rewrite action steps, we go back, we check. But the most important thing I think that we do as well is we report out that data to the teachers. So they know there's transparency, they know exactly where we're at. And finally this year, I feel that LSI is a support, but I'm kind of determining what we need. Based off what we're seeing in those classrooms, we get to decide, hey, this is our focus now, because that's what the data is showing. And so that's kind of our 3-year process, and we're really just moving towards vision on that SIM model. And that's the critical piece.
Thank you so much, Jill. I really appreciate you reiterating that the process, starting with the quality instruction. We can't just expect kids to start teaming. We have to start with quality instruction and those SEL skills. It's so important that we embed those skills in instruction and within our teaming. So thank you. That was a great anecdote. Cheryl is a middle school principal from Weeks, and she has a secondary perspective because she was last year an assistant principal at a high school. So I just wanted, Cheryl, did you want to share anything on this process for you?
I do. Thank you, Sarah. Having been a part of all 3 years of treatment, 2 years at a high school and then year 3 at a middle school, both schools having been part of the the treatment from the word go. It's a pretty interesting perspective, and I appreciate, Jill, everything you said, and you explained that so clearly. I think I've learned some things myself from you, and you're just down the street. When I look at step 2 in particular, where it talks about the classroom visits and the C4I, the coaching for implementation, after we have the trainings, and Jill mentioned that right after usually the trainings, then we have our coach come, and at the secondary level, what that looks like is our instructional coaches and our administrative team go to look at the classrooms to make sure the pieces that we learned in our training are being tried. And, you know, like she said, it's not perfect, but are we trying to implement some of that? I would say my deepest learning were in years 1 and 2 during the C4I process, because what that did is it allowed me to go take a look at a live classroom, see if I understood what was going on in the training, because we get the training and then all of a sudden the next day or the next day or two, we have the visits to the classroom. And so then that gives each of the members of the administrative team, as well as the instructional coaches, we're able to go into a classroom, come out of that classroom, stand in the hallway, talk about what we saw, what we didn't see, maybe sit down in a conference room, and we decide, okay, who's going to go talk to that teacher and provide feedback? And suppose it's one of my instructional coaches. So then what we do is the instructional coach talks about what he or she has seen, and we all kind of add some chime into that. So then she's got a pretty strong coaching content to go back and visit with that teacher. But that's where the leadership is able to learn. I feel like for me, it was the most powerful is during those C4I pieces. So then we know what we're looking for in the classroom, and we're having our hands held by LSI while we do the C4I pieces. It's a little more natural now than it was the first and the second year to get those visits going and the structure in place, but it's a really powerful piece. I would also say the collaboration and coaching that we've received from our LSI leads, they come and they spend a half a day. And for me as a new principal at Weeks, I'll take any support I can get. So sitting down with a district lead from LSI and spending a couple of hours any way I want. So I can ask, can we process the last training? Can we look at the future training? Here's what we're doing for professional development in the middle of this cycle. So that way we can backfill pieces where we know our staff is struggling. And things like that has been really, really powerful. Sometimes she walks classrooms with me. Sometimes I pair her up with some of my admin team. And we just use her in a variety of ways. And this year she's been incredibly, incredibly helpful.
Thanks so much, Cheryl. I really appreciate your reflection and sharing your deep learning with us. That was awesome. So next we're going to go through a couple images. This picture here actually comes from the video that you saw. This is actually at Jill's school. So she's going to talk about teacher as the facilitator and the transformation that occurred in this classroom, amongst others, but in this picture, this classroom.
Yeah, so Katie has always been a great teacher. She was just one of those natural good teachers, did, more of that teacher-centered, but built relationships with her kids. And so when she was one of the first people to dive in, she decided that she was going to take a risk and jump in full force. But what she had to do was, like we said earlier, build those social emotional learning skills, because as you saw in just that brief piece of the video, some really good conversations and kids actually leading it. So before, Katie would be the one and she would know all the information. She would be the one giving the information to the kids. In this video, you can see the transformation of where you can see her kind of in the picture there. She's holding a computer, which she would be tracking. So she's going in, listening to conversations. She used to be probably someone that would rescue. When a kid was struggling, she would somehow help them too much to give them the answer and take away the thinking process. But what she learned is that by doing that, you take away every opportunity for them to get to the analysis or that KU within the taxonomy. So she learned to just observe. She did all the heavy work at the beginning with the mini lesson, knowing the targets. The kids had the success criteria. They knew exactly what they needed to do to be successful that day. That was very evident in our classrooms now, is that students have to know what they're learning, and they need to know what it is that they're learning and what they're going to have to do to show that they're successful. And so she's walking around, observing. Lots of kids, they have role cards. So she realized that kids needed roles. They needed specific jobs of what they needed to do when they come together as a group. Because if you just send them together, you have mass chaos. All kids are talking at once, and there isn't really just specific things taking place to help the learning. And she would walk around and just listen. And every once in a while, if you saw the whole video, you would see her maybe ask one question that would get them thinking a little bit deeper. So she would have those pre-thought questions that helped raise the level of rigor for the students. She's one that would be the first one to start with agree and disagree cards. So that way all kids were running the show. Someone would hold up a disagree, and that student would then call on the other kid instead of the teacher. She really took herself out of the situation and allowed herself to just monitor.
Thank you so much, Jill. That I have to say, I mean, that was one of the highest levels of teaming I've ever seen. It was really phenomenal to watch that. The next picture, we want to focus on the student ownership. So as Jill was talking about her teacher stepping back, so we can't just step back and expect kids to know what to do. We have to teach them, and we have to practice, and we have to model. So Erica, tell me about, I guess, the monitoring and some of those techniques that are occurring in this photo, which is at your school as well.
So yeah, this is a kind of a close-up of a team working together. And I just want to add on to what Jill said about having to teach these skills. I think we just automatically assume that they're going to come to school and they can talk to each other effectively. But can you imagine, like, if kids all knew how to talk to each other and disagree and be okay with it? Like, what great adults we would all become. You know, like, we really have to teach the students all of these skills in order for them to actually use them. Otherwise, she's right, they just go in a little group and it's all madness. So here on the table you see we're okay with using our desks as whiteboards. Students' names are there, and I think if you look really closely, you can kind of see it in colors. I think they have team roles there, so everybody has a responsibility. It's not just the smart kid, it's not just, you know, this person or that person, but everybody has a very specific role, and they're all different roles. Everybody has a unique responsibility. You see text on students' tables. I know in our old kind of way of thinking, the teacher would be the ownership of the text. I would do a read aloud in first grade, and then I would, you know, give them all the information, right? And then they would go off and show me if they learned it or not. But here, the students are owning the learning because the text is right in front of them, getting them their hands on text way more often. These cups here at their tables are a way for them to monitor themselves and how they're doing. So it's not the teacher that's saying, oh, these students, they need help. It's the students determining whether, you know, we're green, we're good, we're moving along just fine. If the team can't figure something out, if they're really struggling with a certain part of the task, then they might move themselves to yellow. And depending on the classroom, I think usually they go to another team to consult with them. So it's fascinating to see them go to each other instead of always following the teacher around like a little train. And that's been a great part of my transformation as a coach, to be able to see what this looks like in upper grade levels. And I don't see that little train of students following the teacher around, ready to ask themselves questions. They figure it out on their own. And if they can't, they go to another team and they consult with them. And it's one team member's responsibility to go talk to another team. That way we don't have everybody up and moving, and that person's responsible for coming back to their group and clearing up some misconceptions, whatever they have. So it's just really awesome to see and be a part of that, and to hear those conversations, because it does take practice. It does take deliberate modeling and checking in to listen. What is this conversation like? What am I listening for here? A lot of really unique components that you don't even think about until it's presented to you, like, oh yeah, this makes sense. They really need these skills, and they need to be able to be taught, like, very intentionally. I was just in a fifth grade classroom the other day, sorry, and I remember just kind of giggling to myself. They were in partners, but I think a pair must have been a little confused whether they could really talk to each other. And I heard one say, "Can I coach?" And then the teacher was like, "Yes, of course you can coach." And so then they went right into that coaching language. That was really neat to hear.
I agree, Erica. It's really cool to see kids, trying to be the teacher. What I loved about being in this classroom was when I walked around, the kids were actually talking about the task. They were actually pushing each other's thinking, and it really was phenomenal. Thank you for explaining it. The skills that these kids are learning are for the new economy. These are the skills that they will need beyond school, that will bring them into college and the workforce. And Cheryl's really going to talk about that because she's at the secondary level.
Yeah, so it was a really good segue from the last slide, and I just want to speak to the picture real quick. There's a student that is helping another group, and so a lot of our teachers give a kid a lanyard, and it'll say helper, expert, coach, and so the teacher having to figure out using their data which students are in a position to assist others gives those students that are selected to be experts or the teacher or the coach a sense of confidence, a sense of I got this. And it's not always the same kids each time. It depends on the particular day, the particular target or success criteria that they've mastered. So kind of the social piece is it's okay to be the smart one. It's okay to ask for help. And she talked about the kids following like a little train. Secondary teachers are rescuers, and they would like to rescue the students anytime there's a problem. And so it's a pretty tough sell for secondary teachers, particularly at the high school level, that if a kid is stuck and can't figure it out, we don't run over and swoop and help. So we do things like 3 before me. You've got to consult your resources, you got to consult your peers, you got to consult an expert before you can talk to the teacher. That is, you have to self-advocate. You have to be able to be comfortable to get up across the room and say, hey, I don't get this, can you help me? So the skills about not being dependent on an adult, figuring out some things on your own, the student advocacy, the culture of connectedness and interdependence as opposed to one of being codependent on the teacher is a piece where, what if you're at a job and you can't locate your boss? Is there anybody else that can help you navigate an issue? It's a skills that everyone needs in the workforce, regardless of a position that they hold. I've got students at the middle school level who are 8th graders that are beginning to hold part-time jobs, so they have to collaborate. Now in Iowa, for a part-time job and you're 14, you can do like McDonald's and a grocery store and that's about it. But they have to be able to work together to do that kind of thing. They've got to be able to solve problems on the spot. So thinking about the skills, whether it's the social emotional piece, the collaborative piece, advocating for yourself, when they start doing that when they're smaller in elementary, and then when we get up to the middle school, it's the middle school kids, if you're in 6th grade, they think that's pretty cool that you got picked to help. That begins to be a little less cool with 7th and 8th graders. However, as we begin to continue to build our culture in our whole school as well as each classroom, that it's okay to be the expert and to continue to learn, that then becomes the norm at the high school level. So I feel like as a district, as we've got schools implementing over time, the way the culture will continue to evolve in the future is going to be one that's going to be really, really helpful in terms of the skills for a new economy.
Thank you, Cheryl. I just, those real life examples, those are really helpful. And that social confidence, that piece about it's okay to be the smartest one, it's okay to need help. And that classroom culture is so important. I'm so glad you brought that up. The next picture actually you're gonna talk to as well, and because this is from Weeks Middle School. This is an awesome example of teaming and really including everyone. Everyone has a voice, and everyone, despite disabilities or language barriers or what have you, everyone is part of the team. So I'll let you lead this one.
Yeah, thank you. This picture actually is of one of our 6th grade language arts teachers. She's brilliant. And in this actual moment and during this picture, she had given some directions to some students, and the kids that you see around her are the facilitators. And so what ended up happening is the facilitators themselves maybe missed part of the directions. And so what ended up happening was she had to quickly do a huddle, grab all the facilitators, bring them to the front, and give them a little bit of reteach direction so that they can go back to their groups and try to manage the groups as best they could. So that's kind of what's going on in the picture. What's nice about using academic teams, depending on the teacher, they might do something generic for a particular task like timekeeper, recorder, facilitator, connector. I've seen teachers be really creative about different roles they have, so that you can tailor roles to the task, and you can tailor roles so that everyone has a place to participate. So maybe if you have a student with a language barrier, maybe they're not going to be super comfortable to facilitate, but they can have a role and be the timekeeper. The piece of creating the task so that it's interdependent, meaning they're not sitting in groups that are just furniture arrangement doing individual work, but the task that's designed is actually interdependent, helps create a dependency on each other to be able to get where they need to go academically. They've got to rely on each other. Something else that we've been preaching in Des Moines and largely most of my career have been relationships that we have with our students. I wrote my dissertation on it. And so what I think I've come to realize even in the past 6 months is, while it's really important for teachers to have great relationships with their students, and we know that's a huge piece to getting kids in class and staying in class. At the secondary level, that can be problematic as we matriculate. Attendance is an issue sometimes. What I think is even probably more important is thinking about the social emotional learning component. When kids have healthy relationships with other kids and they feel valued in that culture, in that classroom, they're going to come to class and they're going to participate. So I think the relationship piece, not just between the teacher and the student, between the student and the other students. So we're working hard at Weeks to make sure that our staff are facilitating opportunities so that kids are building relationships with each other. So when the culture in the classroom, provides positive structure, motivation, and the teachers in a belief that they can all succeed, that then lets everybody relax, take a risk, get to know each other a little better, and then the walls and barriers for middle school and high school students begin to decrease. So once we have a really healthy culture, the teaming piece becomes a welcoming environment for all students, regardless of where they're from, what language they speak, what gender they are, ability level, all of that.
Thank you, Cheryl. The relationship piece is so important. Again, we heard it again, but also, the SEL competencies, when we talk about those and we think about teaming, it's just such a nice alignment with those two pieces. And actually, I have to tell you, I was here when this happened, and we now took this idea of group huddle, and it's part of our training, because we thought, how cool is that? A sense of being on a team of teams, a team of facilitators, and taking that back to my other team. And that was just such a cool thing. Thank you for sharing so much. I appreciate it. I wanted to ask Mike, any final thoughts on any of these photos from your perspective at the district level and working, kind of with principals?
Yeah, as I was hearing the principals and, Sarah and Erica and Cheryl talking, it's, Sarah, Erica, and Jill talking, and Cheryl, sorry, was really just the power of the coaching through line that I'm hearing and that I see on a daily basis. Lowering our span of control as directors, we're able to be in buildings a lot more, be able to be with principals, walking classrooms with principals, with coaches, with teams, and we just see the power of the impact of students and how a coaching through line where a principal can have conversations with coaches in the hallways and with teams in the hallways, and then we're part of that as well, and we can take what we learn at one building and bring it to another building and have specific examples of what we're seeing, and then be able to unite those across our networks. But then also as directors, we sit down and talk about what we're seeing in our buildings and how we can unite those across our district. So we're starting to see a huge, just a real consistent language, real consistent opportunities for all of our students, because in the past, I don't think we could say that honestly, of saying that, if you're in a third grade classroom here, are you going to get the same experience and the same opportunities as you are in a third grade classroom and in a different part of the city or in a different school? And, that consistency and that expectation is being set, and we're seeing how that's impacting, and the data is, district data that was presented, we're starting to see how that is moving as a district and not just in pockets.
Thank you, Mike. It's so impressive to hear all of you actually share your stories and your growth mindset, but really the idea of building this capacity and that through line, that is so important. And all of these anecdotes and all of this field evidence showed you the results of that through that data that you saw at the beginning of the presentation. So thank you very much. That's the end of the photos here, Eric.
Yeah, so we have a few questions coming in. I want to respect everybody's time and thank you for all attending and listening to this incredible story, as well as the data that Lindsay shared. We want to open this up for questions and comments. You can submit your questions using the GoToWebinar question pane, as some of you already have, located on your screen. So we're going to dive right in, and Sarah, I'll shoot the questions to you, and perhaps we can facilitate among the group. So the first question is, how do you deal with pushback specifically from teachers and or school leaders?
So I'm probably going to ask Cheryl to handle that one. Not that you deal with pushback, but I just
no, certainly not.
You have your hands
one of the things that I think has been helpful in both of the environments that I've been in, having the district support. This is the direction that we're going. These are the expectations, and we're all in. So it wasn't super flexible. Do you want to participate or do you not? I would have to say the building leader is the linchpin of whether it's going to move forward or whether it's not going to. This isn't easy work. It doesn't happen overnight. Having switched buildings, something I noticed where there were things that the high school I was at last year were doing that the middle school I'm at this year, they haven't quite mastered that piece. They're not quite sure about it, but there's things we're doing at the middle school that weren't things that kind of stuck when I was at my previous high school. So trying to figure out the benefit of that is I've got great resources down the street. There are teachers, a few, not many, who maybe weren't so excited about teaching this way, the level of collaboration required. And so it takes a strong administrative team and a lot of coaching. And if you're not ready to embrace, to me, we give you some coaching, we help you. We support you, and the design model is there for a ton of support. And if that's not something you're interested in, then maybe this isn't for you. So there's been some of those conversations, and I think some people have probably moved on. But the leadership support from LSI has been amazing, and the directives and the confidence that our district leadership and support that they've shown us has been great. So it wasn't ever super optional, but you can't disagree with the why of why we're doing it. You can't disagree with the data that's saying there's a lot of things that really are working. There are things you can disagree with, and as a pilot school, there's been things that have been super bumpy, and we've navigated that with our friends from LSI, and there's things that have been super smooth. And so as we kind of negotiate our relationship and what can we change to make it better, and being part of a study, there's certain pieces that have to stay consistent. We recognize that, so it's a balance. But the idea is we coach you and we work with you really hard. And if this isn't something that you're going to embrace, then maybe this isn't the right spot for you.
Sarah,
Cheryl,
I'm stealing a little bit on that.
Sorry. Yes, Mike. I was going to say, Cheryl, I'm stealing all in. That's Lindsay and I decided that's our new theme. All in. I love that. But yeah, Mike, definitely share.
Sorry. One of the big things that because the principal or administrator was mentioned on that question was I thought with what we did in DMPS was very smart in front loading our administrators first. We front loaded our central office first with knowledge, and then we brought in our administrators, our principals, our building administrators, and front loaded them in order to provide the most amount of support for who we knew were going to roll this out, who are going to put the hard, deep work into this, which is a teaching force. And so with that, our central office, our associate superintendent, Matt Smith, and our executive directors, Tim Schott and Susie Tallman, spent a lot of time working with our union as well. And they brought them along and on board and front loaded them with information. And so we had wraparound services planned for and prepared for, and you can't plan or prepare for everything in advance. But with that front load of multiple layers of support for the teaching staff, I think that really brought a lot of our major concerns or major stressors down. And then, like Cheryl was talking about, and then when it came to a manageable point that we could balance and handle things at the building level. And that's where, again, our span of control and where the principals are getting the information and really coaching through and working through with teachers and leadership teams to support the teachers. But I think that front load of our administrative staff in order to provide a good layer of support was a huge start for our district.
Yeah, massively important, and I'm so glad you brought that up. Front loading from the top with the knowledge, that's really a takeaway I'm going to have from this webinar.
Sarah, can I add one more thing?
Yes, of course.
Yeah, something that when Mike talked, it made me think about this. When the high school where I was previous to this, the middle school, both schools started at the same time. The way the district said, you know, we'd like you to be part of this project. It's going to be a lot of hard work, but you've been selected, which made us have a sense of pride, like, oh, we got picked. So that was like a good thing. And we were told the reason we had been picked is because the culture of our building, the willingness of our staff, and the healthy PLCs that we had existing in our building. And if you're thinking about embarking on this work, the culture has to be probably pretty strong, a strong leader in place, and then the functionality of PLCs has to be one of collaboration, because we can start spinning our wheels if the foundational pieces aren't where we need them to be. Not to say everybody's got to have it 100% before you embark on this work, because that isn't the case, but making sure those two pieces are in place is pretty important.
Yes, thank you, Cheryl.
So we have another question coming in, and this was based off of one of the pictures, and I think someone had referenced that the teacher was using some sort of tracker and tracking either the performance or something in the classroom. Can one of you explain that a little bit more?
Probably Erica.
Yeah, I would love to. This is my thing, the standards tracker. I was super excited about it when it was first introduced, because previously, to know where my students were, I used checklists and checklists and checklists. And I was the only one who knew what my checklist meant, because there was so much writing all over them, you know, where students had changed reading levels or how many words they got right out of the word sites or whatever it was. So this standards tracker, which is on the computer from LSI, it's off of their website, off of their main page. It organized our standards, and it really forced us to be teaching from the standards. That's where all of our planning absolutely starts. It doesn't start from what we did last year or what we did the year before or what's in this really dusty file here. It starts with the standard, and then it goes down from there, exactly what the students will be learning. And so we're just so focused in the classroom, always figuring out what it is the students know and are able to show us and to show each other. And we mark it in the standards tracker. It's a fancy little click, and it's so simple. You can organize groups, you can see who you've met with, see who you haven't met with. You can display it in the classroom. We don't have the students' names, but we have like the donut, and when it's all green, that means everybody's met the target, and it's a big celebration, and it's so much fun to see, and the kids get really excited for each other, and the students get excited for each other. It's not just the teacher being excited because they checked off that standard. It's the students are excited about it, and that's huge.
Thanks, Erica. Yeah, the daily minute-to-minute monitoring, definitely super powerful. Thank you.
Okay, so we're a little bit past time, so we're going to wrap up this webinar and extend a warm thank you to Cheryl, Jill, Erica, and Michael from Des Moines Public Schools. You guys have been awesome, and I really appreciate this. Thanks also to Lindsay, Sarah, Janice, and Libba. One final note as everybody closes out of the webinar, there is a 2-question survey. We would really appreciate to get your feedback. It helps us continually improve our webinars and continue to provide you valuable information. So thank you, everybody, and have a good day.